intelligent talk, current affairs, sport, social issues, entertainment, culture, and more. Welcome to the city. Talk City 91.1 FM, your address for talk.
Thank you for the time. Oh yeah, oh say Baba thank you for the time. Hey, yeah, 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 yeah. Yeah, yeah, yeah. For centuries we have been separated, but we further pleaded for we to be reunited. Some came from far, some from there, from Asia, some from Africa, the Caribbean, Europe and America to celebrate.
Hello, 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 and welcome. Welcome to Indaba, where knowledge grows. This program seeks to find consensus on issues which affect African lives here in Trinidad and Tobago, the Caribbean, and across the African diaspora. The program is hosted by the Emancipation Support Committee and is coming to you live from Talk City's studios here at 11A Maraval Road. Indaba to our listening audience. And we begin I wanted to make sure that I have it right here. But let me tell you what you're going to be coming to listen to today. So let me introduce the hosts and the content of this program. We're going to be having the Caribbean Preparatory Meeting for the second meeting of the UN Permanent Forum of People of African Descent. Having an interview with Dr. Chenzira Kahina and Dr. Marie Lemmy. And it's going to be Reverend Kwame Kamau who will be leading the discussion. So without further delay, let's go in and listen. Let me see if I can get them up here. Hello and good evening.
A very good evening to you, Karen. It's always a pleasure being in your company. Of course, tonight, per the advice of Sister Karen at Talk City 91.1 FM, we are going to be leading off tonight's discussion at Indaba with the whole centered piece of the Caribbean Conference. What Caribbean Conference? The Caribbean Conference that is the preparatory, as it were, meeting for the second ICSWGPFPAD. What do all of these acronyms mean? Well, you need to stay tuned to find out. My co-host with me on tonight is no less a person than Dr. Claudius Fergus, but I do have some very special guests. I have with me all the way from the United States of America, Dr. Marie Lemmy, Education and Outreach Communications Committee member of the International Civil Society Working Group for the Permanent Forum on People of African Descent. She's also a psychologist as well, based in the New York State, as well as a Haitian origin humanitarian and healer. I first want to say a very pleasant good night to you and welcome. Welcome, Dr. Lemmy.
Thank you. Thank you for having me. Thank you.
Oh, absolutely. The pleasure is indeed ours. Also joining us tonight, we have a griot, an educator, creative activist, technologist, priestess, author, cultural heritage preservationist, researcher, global visionary, holistic naturopath, consultant and founder of Per as well as a Caribbean, as it were, Reparations Council representative at the Executive Council level for and on behalf of the Caribbean Pan-African Network. Ladies and gentlemen, I give you my Supreme Queen Mother, no less a person than Dr. Chenzira Kahina. A very pleasant good night to you, Queen Mother.
Greetings. What's up, everyone? It's an honor to be in this great company.
Absolutely. Now, per the usual, I don't do this alone. We do this as a team. And I'm favored on this evening to have Baba Fergus joining us. Of course, he leads out the Africa Report segment, which comes shortly after. But for all intents and purposes, we just want to say good night to him. So, salute to you, Baba Fergus.
Good evening and greetings to everyone.
Good evening.
Absolutely. When I grow up, I always said to myself, I want to be Dr. Claudius Fergus. For all intents and purposes, we want to get straight into the meat of the conversation tonight. Often, when the United Nations is looking at reports, looking at statistics, looking at information concerning this region, the Caribbean is often lumped into the category with Latin America. While that serves a geographical purpose, it in many instances undermines the uniqueness, the specialty, the distinction that is the Pan African, the Pan Caribbean experience. Tonight, out of the US Virgin Islands, we have Dr. Chenzira tonight, and we also have out of Haiti, Haitian background, Dr. Lemmy on tonight. First question to you, Dr. Lemmy. As a Haitian origin healer, psychologist, and now member of the ICSWG, how important do you think it is for us to host the first Caribbean conference, first preparatory meeting for the Caribbean? The Caribbean is finally getting a voice. Jamaica is getting a voice. Antigua is getting a voice. St. Lucia, Barbados, Guyana. Why did I start naming names? I'll run out of names pretty soon, and someone is going to throw me under the bus. But for all intents and purposes, the Caribbean is being spotlighted. We are being highlighted. We are being given an opportunity to talk about our own narrative and center ourselves in the conversation at the United Nations level by way of this side event. As a permanent forum ICSWG member, how important is this for the Caribbean?
I think it's extremely important. And also, as a psychologist, as a healer, I think it's worth for you to listen to the person that is affected. Yes, it's good sometimes, like, when we speak as a family, but it's best for the individual to be heard so that you hear the narrative from the first person instead of somebody else advocating on their behalf. There's nothing as important as hearing your own voice. Part of human rights is the ability and the right to speak for yourself and the right to be heard. So we must be heard, and we also must speak for ourselves. Our voice is as important as anybody else's voice.
Oh, thank you so very much for that conversation piece, because it allows me now to segue into my next question with Dr. Chenzira. And that question is this: as it relates to our four focal points, one of them has to do with the use of data and data collection, evidence based planning, evidence based, as it were, methodologies in terms of treating with the varied and certainly diverse issues that affect us in the Caribbean. How important is the conversation piece around having the right data, disaggregating data, so we know within the Caribbean exactly what's happening beyond the anecdotal experience, beyond our personal narrative? How important is it to have that data available to us when we are dealing with international diplomacy, especially at the level of the United Nations?
That's a very loaded question in regards to us having less than an hour to actually share and discourse. I'm going to start there. Data is going to be essential. That way, it allows for strategic implementation of all of these policies, especially in dealing with the United Nations or any international agency, any governmental agency, any non governmental agency in terms of planning, implementation, and so forth. Specifically, what I would add to that inquiry is that it's having the data and the right data sets. It's having the qualified individuals that are going to be able to properly aggregate that information once it's collected, and then to be able to provide some form of an interpretation on how it actually can be implemented. How do we affect change? How do we transform things in that regard? Hence, looking at some of the documents that are going to be highlighted during this Caribbean Civil Society preparatory conference, of course, data is at the essence, at the center of what we're really engaged in. And it's very important that we look at that and that we look at what is coming from the respective organizations that have collaborated, specifically what is already available from the Emancipation Support Committee of Trinidad and Tobago, what has already been documented and aggregated from the Caribbean Pan-African Network. Also, what is actually going on, what are some of the, the elements of this data set that's coming from this permanent forum on people of African descent. Again, looking specifically at what information has already been gathered and then properly assessing and providing implementation strategies that are very effective. But again, that question is a very engaging question because it requires that we look at the data sets and then begin to provide that appropriate form of analysis.
Absolutely, absolutely. And of course, one of the things that we need to collect data on, and beyond the collection of the data, the proper analysis, having the right persons who can do a proper assessment of same so that the narrative, the story that is told based on the data sets is clear, is concise, and communicated not only to the masses, but also to the policymakers and those that can affect change. Next question to you, Dr. Lemon. I see that Brother Shabaka Kambon is with us. So very happy to have you, my brother. Absolutely. The next question to you, Dr. Lemmy, is this one. And especially as a healer and a humanitarian, in Haiti right now, there is a humanitarian crisis. There is certainly a health crisis being experienced by our brothers and sisters, our comrades in Haiti. Certainly, when you are in the cut and trust of a humanitarian crisis, certainly for you, health and wellness is compromised. However, for the Caribbean by and large, whether we are looking at communicable diseases or non communicable diseases, the Caribbean region is ranking very high in terms of diabetes, in terms of cancer, in terms of atherosclerosis, which leads to, on the one hand, heart attacks, on the other hand, strokes. How important is it for us as a Caribbean to talk about health and wellness from a holistic perspective? And as we zero in to the discussion as it relates to Haiti in particular, when you are based in a crisis, when you're operating in a crisis zone, might I add an iatrogenic crisis, which is to say a man made crisis, not a crisis that happened as a result of nature. How do we begin to bring about the necessary healing, the necessary recovery, the necessary rehabilitation? How important is it for us to focus our attention on Haiti right now and the health crisis taking place in the wider Caribbean? Dr. Lemmy.
It's very important, especially for people in general, globally, from a Pan African perspective, is the whole concept of mental health, the ability to express, to say, I'm not feeling well, I'm not doing well, can you help me? Because we sometimes, especially, we feel like, we have to carry the burden. And as you say, like, sometimes, like, cancer, diabetes, all those things need to be healed. So we need to listen to each other. When somebody say they're not feeling well, it's not just easily, okay, let's let herbal medicine, indigenous medicines are extremely important, and we need to incorporate that as well into Western practices. But it's very, very important, like, for us to get a holistic perspective, to treat the whole person, like, from a repertory perspective, to listen what is ailing you. Don't keep it in. Let it out. How can I help you? How can I help you carry that load? How far can I take you across the street and maybe turn it on to somebody else? So it's very important, like, not just to say, well, this is them. They're always in crisis. Why are they always in crisis? What's going on? What are the intervening variable that is making them in crisis? Because we were a very fertile society. We used to pay and occupy friends in a way. So why is it now we having so much problem? What's happening? So we need people to come and help us as well as us helping ourselves to get out the crisis that we in that is destroying our hospitals. Our doc in Haiti, the doctors cannot go to work because the gang violence have taken over. So we need to look at that. How do we help them? How do we help each other get out of the situation that we're in?
Oh, thank you for that response, Dr. Kahina. My last question to you before I turn over to my co host. I'm sure they're chomping at the bits to get in live into tonight's discussion. This one is a loaded one. If you thought the last question was loaded, you better buckle up tonight, Supreme Queen Mother. Haiti has said, the Caribbean has said, they do not want U.S. And or UN military intervention as a strategy in Haiti. That the Caribbean should be front and center in terms of leading that process towards the road of recovery. Of course, there is a great historic reason for that. Can you help us tonight in the lead up to next week's Caribbean preparatory meeting for the second, as it were, permanent forum on people of African descent, which is going to be taking place in May, May 30th to June 2nd, right there in the New York headquarters of the United Nations. Why is the Caribbean saying, why is Haiti saying military presence? No, thank you. Why is that? Help us to unpack that.
America needs to focus on American issues. And that's one of the historical fallacies in terms of being a democratic country. I'll say a couple of countries though: República Dominicana, Haiti, Cuba, Grenada. I'll just pause there. Invasions are what they are, and the Caribbean does not require the intervention of another layer of that form of militaristic terrorism. And it would not be in the best interest of the people of the Caribbean, period. And that's one of the reasons why persons still hold on to that same kind of trauma from what transpired in previous years. And the historical legacy of the US in the Caribbean speaks for itself. That's why it's so important that this preparatory session that's taking place on the 23rd of May transpires and provides that type of data, that type of information, and that perspective where persons can actually recognize what are some of the recommendations being granted, shared, extended to for this second meeting on the UN Permanent Forum for People of African Descent. I think it's really important that persons recognize that the Caribbean is quite capable, quite mature, quite civilized to be able to represent and address these types of internal issues in the region, within the region. It doesn't require external in that type of intervention, and it would not be to the well-being, in the best interest of the well-being of the people of the Caribbean. And that's speaking of people in the Caribbean wherever we are. I think I need to say that as well. Yeah, I think it's also important that while this session is coming forward on the 23rd between 11 and 3:30 Eastern Standard Time, I'd like to just highlight that there's another layer of the aims of this particular convening to really amplify, and I want to highlight what's here, to amplify the voices of the Caribbean Pan-African community, to strengthen the participation of Caribbean civil society in the processes of the UN Permanent Forum on People of African Descent, and to articulate the views of Caribbean civil society in regard to contributions and the various discussions that are going to take place in this forum. I think it's really critical that to answer your question, this one was a little bit easier than the last one, because clearly the people of the Caribbean are quite, again, qualified, have the skills, talents, and expertise, and the historical strength to be able to address these issues internally and to present very clear, very clear and defined recommendations on taking corrective action. I think it's important to know that in this particular pre-convening, right, that the four areas are around Pan-Africanism and the decolonization in the Caribbean. So that answers your question. The second, reparatory justice and the Caribbean reparations movement. So that is tied to your inquiry as well. And then the significance of the Caribbean led data collection on Caribbean people of African ancestry. I think that's very important in regard to your inquiry initially around data and the respective sets. And then also tying into what Dr. Lemmy just shared quite succinctly, the health and people of African ancestry in the Caribbean and the Caribbean diaspora. Because the way that you destroy people and make it to the point where they do not get to be full participants in their own decolonization and their own sovereign empowerment is by destroying their health, by stealing their land, and by invading their spaces. So if we can do away with some of that, then I would say that we should be able to have a very successful convening and be able to move forward quite progressively and positively in Ma'at. I hope I answered your question.
You did a masterful job. I couldn't do it better myself. Dr. Fergus, I defer to you now. Do you have a question for one of the distinguished guests on tonight?
Yes, I would begin by briefly referencing Dr. Lemmy's opening statement with respect to, representation and the opportunity to be heard. The question that I had was partly answered by our great sister, Dr. Chen Zero, but I will still proceed. Now, it is good to be heard, but I often wonder about the other side. Who is listening? So it's good to speak, but then it's good to know who is listening. There's a popular Nigerian saying, the majority will always have their say, the minority will always have their way. So what we find is that the United Nations, now this forum falls under the United Nations Human Rights Commission, but there's a difficulty for me where, we have to reconcile with the same UN, not the same commission, but the same UN nevertheless, that seem to support and often sanction, or at least they are on the side of imperialist sanctions against certain states which contribute to the violation of human rights, exacerbate human rights, even if there are elements of it, but generally they even trigger of human rights violation and seem to sustain. There is no voice from the UN with respect to that. We have our examples, the two clearest examples in the Caribbean, Cuba and Haiti. We can cross the continent where we know, for example, US sanctions crippled Zimbabwe that had a very strong, prosperous economy, so that the interests of capitalist imperialist states seems to circumvent human rights issues when it comes to certain areas that the US can define as a strategic interest and that kind of thing. So strategic interests always seem to beat human rights. How do we reconcile those two? Would the forum, the Caribbean Forum, address those issues in a way that we can demand change and not ask for change? Because there's a saying that power only yields to demand, right? How do we bring demand into that? Right now, I don't know if Shabaka probably follows up. The Cuban situation is dire. If you go to Cuba, it's dire. And that's because of US sanctions. The US sanctions. The UN is silent about those. They have been silent for decades. I pause there for a response. Yes, any of our sisters can respond to
I
that.
actually thought you were directing it to Dr. Lemmy, so I was going to, let her.
Well, I began with her, but I took off with your very cogent response as well. Indirectly, yeah.
Go ahead, my sister. If need be, I'll follow. You lead.
Give
let,
thanks.
let me
Go
just
ahead,
jump
Doctor.
in here,
Jump. Let me go,
brothers
Doctor.
and sisters. And let me say that, when we think about the United Nations, we have to make a distinction between the General Assembly and the Security Council. So, uh, as an example, to answer your question, Dr. Fergus, the General Assembly in their last vote on the question of sanctioning Cuba, U.S. sanctions against Cuba, it was 184 to 2. Only two nations voted to continue sanctions on Cuba at the General Assembly. That is the United States of America, which is the perpetrator, and Israel, their best partner in the Middle East.
And nothing
All
happens. That's the point, Shabaka. And nothing happens. That's what I'm saying. Who is listening? So
Yes,
that the listening power goes to just two states, not to the hundred and something that voted.
yeah. So according to the General Assembly, sanctions on Cuba, unilateral sanctions by the United States of America, are illegal. The problem with the way the United Nations was set up back in the 1940s was that the power to act comes from the Security Council, which is made up of a few permanent nations and now some extra countries that get to sit in there for certain periods, the designated periods of time.
But even in the Security Council, you have this element of veto power. Not all of them
Exactly.
have this equal power on the Security Council.
Yeah, so there's a lot of talk for the last couple decades now about reforming the institution so that it reflects better the democratic consensus of the world, as opposed to the those who were in power back in the 1940s and one or two others who have been brought in occasionally to the Security Council. So there's a lot of conversation about that, and I think that that has to be one of the areas where we put our emphasis as people of the South, people of color in the 21st century.
Absolutely, absolutely. One of the things that you said is quite powerful, speaking to the power of the Security Council. But another very important question is that of who is paying the piper, because whoever pays the piper calls the tune. And US dollars account for a pretty huge percentage of the UN budget. And so too do many of the other perpetrators of these genocidal, ethnocidal, certainly in the case of land, going even into the destruction and the decimation of land with impunity because of this whole issue of who is paying, who is in charge. Closing remarks, Dr. Lemmy, closing remarks. Dr. Chenzira, I'll start with you, Dr. Lemmy, as we look forward to this preparatory meeting coming from the Caribbean. If tonight's dialogue is any indication of what's to take place next week, certainly we have a lot in store for us. Give me your closing remarks as we look forward to this very engaging conference.
My closing remark basically to what the Claudius mentioned, that it's nice to be heard, but who's listening? And part of the outreach committee that I'm in is to outreach to the larger population to make sure more of our people are aware what's happening, so we could have their support and to have them affect changes within the United States. As you mentioned, the United States is paying the piper, but our taxes is what keeps the United States going. So we need to start educating our people and mobilize them to be much more active as to what's happening within the global community. And that being said, I'm inviting everybody because the international community, the ICSW, we have an opening ceremony that we invited everybody to in Harlem, the cradle of Black civilization in New York. Everybody's welcome on May 29th to our opening ceremony and as well as our closing ceremony. I'm hoping to see all your lovely faces to be in there. So hoping to meet you guys in person. I'm looking forward to that. So that's one of the main reasons why I'll be at that ceremony is to
Thank
see.
you. Thank you so much, Dr. Lemmy. Dr. Chen, we could go on all night, but time, the clock is against us. Closing remarks, Supreme Queen Mother.
I really encourage persons to come and attend the Caribbean Civil Society Preparatory Conference. That's really going to provide an opportunity for us to actually decree, not just make a declaration, not even extending these demands so that they are implementable. That'll be Tuesday, May 23rd from 11 to 3:30. And again, it's being collaboratively co-sponsored by the Emancipation Support Committee of Trinidad and Tobago, CPAN, And of course, for those who didn't know these letters, the internet, la otra palabra, English, la otra, IC,
SWG.
SWG, thank you for the
Yeah.
thank you very, very much for that.
Yeah.
Because ideally, we want persons to make sure that they are participatory. If you're not participatory, it's very difficult to be engaged. Standing for International Civil Society Working Group. A lot of times we get caught up in the letters, but let's use this as an opportunity to move forward so that we can make some transformations throughout the Caribbean, because the Caribbean civilization is very deserving, worthy, and it's that time right now. Give thanks.
There are two questions I'm going to ask, but we are not going to answer them until we get into the Caribbean conference, that preparatory meeting. Question number one: France apologized to the Francophone nations and is operating from the perspective where it's saying that it wants to engage reparations. Number one, is that enough? And then number two, with regards to Haiti, what is the debt owed to Haiti in light of what France has done to this amazing Caribbean nation? The second question that follows in tandem is with regards to Pan-Africanism and decolonization. Can we afford to continue in the Caribbean with these, as it were, monuments to genocide, is how our very illustrious brother Shabaka Kambon puts it? Can we afford to operate in the Caribbean space where there are still territories operating under colonial control, operating under imperial control? We can't answer those questions tonight, but certainly next week, Tuesday, the 23rd of May, from 12:30 Eastern Standard Time to 5 p.m. Eastern Standard Time, we will be dealing with these questions and so much more. I want to thank my guest, Dr. Lemmy, and certainly Dr. Chenzira, for showing up on tonight and doing such a wonderful job of it. But as at this time, we now turn over, of course, to Dr. Claudius Fergus, who is going to lead us into tonight's Africa Report.
Okay, so I will begin with a phrase, a well-known phrase to Pan-Africanists. We are Africans, not because we were born in Africa, but because Africa was born in us. And this evening's Africa Report will try to demonstrate this important axiom by taking a look at a project of Liberia. I've never talked about Liberia in the lifespan of the Africa Report, so this is a great opportunity this evening to do so. And in relation to one of its diaspora connections right here in the Caribbean. Bring up that map for us, please, Renee, and let us get going. Thank you. The post-emancipation 19th century Caribbean experienced multiple and diverse waves of migrations of mainly African peoples from their island homes, comparable in number to the multi-ethnic in-migration of indentured laborers. Based on per capita, Bajans were the most mobile population in the Caribbean. These restless Caribbean migrants, in search of true freedom and better economic opportunities, moved around the Caribbean. They traversed Central, North, and South America and across the Atlantic, mainly to Africa and Europe. The most popular African destinations were Ghana, South Africa, and Liberia. In this week's edition of the Africa Report, we focus on a Liberian project called the Sankofa Pilgrimage to Barbados, which is scheduled for exactly 1 year from now, from the 6th to the 13th of April 2024, but the planning of which began in earnest last week. The pilgrimage speaks to the historical ties between Barbados and Liberia and the legacies of Bajans in Liberia. Before emancipation in the British colonies, Africans had only one model of a nation-state in the hemisphere, in which black people were free and constituted the ruling class. That was Haiti. Many Africans under colonial slavery wished to recreate the Haitian model in West Africa. They saw themselves not just as repatriates, but as colonizers who would save Africa from white colonization and all its evils. In the late 18th century, British capitalists fronting as abolitionists started the colony of Sierra Leone. Although ruled as a British colony, Sierra Leone was really colonized by thousands of blacks deported from London to curb interracial mixing. Also by thousands of black veterans from Canada who had fought in the War of American Independence for the British. Added to these were thousands of black veterans of the West India Regiment, emancipated by a special act of 1807. Hundreds of Jamaican Maroons, defeated in the Second Maroon War in 1796. And tens of thousands of native Africans from the Gulf of Guinea and the Central West Africa, who were freed from slave ships by British and other naval squadrons. In the wake of the successful Haitian Revolution, the United States of America had a similar desire to empty the country of its fast-growing free black population, and came up with the American Colonizing Society, which set out to colonize Liberia with African Americans. Immense pressure was put on free blacks to emigrate to Liberia. Both Sierra Leone and Liberia, therefore, were founded on race supremacist ideology. The name of Liberia's capital, Monrovia, named after American President James Monroe of the Monroe Doctrine, is testimony to this racism. After Liberia declared itself an independent republic in 1847, it began to attract more voluntary African American migrants and Afro-Caribbeans as well, inspired by Back to Africa activists such as Martin Delany of the United States and the Caribbean-born activists such as Robert Campbell and Edward Wilmot Blyden, who settled in Liberia in 1850. Immediately upon the Declaration of Independence, Liberia's first president, Joseph Roberts, paid an official visit to Barbados on his way to the United States. The visit kindled hope in black Bajans that the dream of emancipation, which the British denied them, might be finally achieved in Africa. In 1862, Wilmot Blyden, who was then Liberia's Secretary of State, sent a delegation to the Caribbean to encourage Africans to migrate to Liberia. Taking a cue from the white-initiated American Colonization Society, black Barbadians founded the Barbados Colonizing Society to promote emigration to Africa. In February 1864, Liberia's Parliament passed an act which authorized the president to reach out to Africans in the Caribbean. The following month, President Daniel Warner issued a proclamation titled, "To the Descendants of Africa Throughout the West Indian Islands." In this proclamation, President Warner declared, quote, "Brethren of the Antilles, we are one in origin and destiny. We have the same history of centuries of suffering, of tribulation and woe." End of quote. The declaration encouraged Caribbean Africans to return to their fatherland and assist in the building up of an African nationality. This declaration was Pan-Africanism in action, which Osagyefo Kwame Nkrumah of Ghana would build upon almost 100 years later, using some of the same Blydian concepts, such as African nationality and the African Renaissance. President Warner put his money where his mouth was and set aside $4,000 to support the emigration project from Barbados. In addition, the Liberian government allocated 25 acres of land to each Bajan family and 10 acres for each single immigrant. In retrospect, this gesture was reparations in action. Some of the key elements and principles of CARICOM's 10-point plan were there, including repatriation, psychological rehabilitation, financial indemnity, citizenship, and land. On the 6th of April 1865, 346 Bajans embarked on the ship Cora, final destination Monrovia, Liberia. That's the significance of the launch of the Sankofa pilgrimage last month, marking the 158th anniversary of the arrival of the Cora in Monrovia. In sharp contrast to the high mortality of the slave trade's Middle Passage, not one person lost his life on the Cora. In fact, not one person was reported ill on the 2-month-long voyage. The immigrant Bajans comprised over 50 families and extended families, among whom were 231 children. The Bajans were hard-working agriculturists and skilled craftsmen, and thus a major asset to Liberia's development. It was recorded of them, there were but few of their number that could not read, write, and cipher when they arrived in the country, which made them the most accomplished group of migrants of the 19th century. Two of Liberia's presidents were descendants of Bajan immigrants. One was Arthur Barclay, born in Barbados, and his cousin, Edwin Barclay, born in Liberia. Other well-known Liberian names with Bajan roots include Padmore, Port, Prescott, Bourne, Cummins, Wilkie, and Wiles. The Sankofa Pilgrimage Project offers great scope and hope for bridging the Atlantic with more frequent cultural and commemorative tours, as well as regular commercial flights. We have had the promise of Air Peace, which was aborted because of COVID-19, and the more recent Nigerian-led Air Antigua airline, which collapsed shortly after launching. West Africa to the Caribbean is a natural air corridor. It confounds the imagination that our leaders on both sides of the Atlantic have not been able to operationalize even one successful route between any of the multiple destinations since independence. In the meantime, let us have more of these Sankofa reunions. Yes, as I said, let us have more of these Sankofa reunions. And Air Peace is actually back. Air Peace is Nigeria's largest airline. That's breaking news, by the way. It is Africa's latest outreach project to the Caribbean. Air Peace has invested 80% controlling, how you call it, shares or whatever, in reinvigorating LIAT, and that will allow it managerial control so that they are going to privatize LIAT, which may or may not be a good thing for the traveling public. It may be good for LIAT, but of course it could be something very expensive for the traveling public. Nonetheless, Air Peace has an excellent record. They are the largest international airline in Nigeria, and its manager, Onyema, has tremendous experience in not only the airline business, multiple businesses. He is a businessman par excellence. So we look forward to that and hope that that would springboard into a transatlantic operation as well, where Air Peace could come probably to one destination, and the LIAT connection can take passengers, to different directions. I hope that that materializes, because it would be a blessing for the Caribbean. I pause there for my fellow host. Over to you, Brother Shabaka. Your mic is on mute. Shabaka.
All right, thank you for the Africa report there, Dr. Fergus. And of course, welcome, Dr. Phillips. Welcome to Indaba today.
Thank you.
Right, so let me just make a quick announcement. Tomorrow is actually Haitian Flag Day. Back in 1803, on the 18th of May, that flag that we know of, that blue and red flag, it's made so famous when Dessalines ripped the white out of the tricolor, was unfurled for the first time in 1803. Fun fact, in Jacmel in 1806, they used the same material, the same cloth that they used to make the Haitian flag, to make the first Venezuelan flag, which then became the prototype for countries like Colombia and Ecuador. So it's, the Haitian flag is a very important flag. Now, tonight, we are fortunate to have Dr. Phillips with us. He is the Executive Director of the African Cultural Development Association, akin to the Emancipation Support Committee in Guyana. He's the chair of the Guyana Reparations Committee and vice chair of the CARICOM Reparations Committee. And of course, he is in a position to give us an update on what's happening with the reparations movement in the region. So, Dr. Phillips, let me put it to you this way. It seems that we are in a very special historical moment where there's a new or broad global acknowledgement of the ravages of racism and white supremacy. It seems to be a particularly fertile ground for the discourse on reparations. How are we doing in this particular moment?
Thank you, Shabaka. And before I answer that, let me thank Ambassador Reverend Kwame Como for inviting me here. And also to say that I was very informed by your guests. As a matter of fact, I'd like to ask Claudius Fergus to loan me that Indaba, that Sankofa production, because we have two TV programs here, the Reparations Group, and I would love to show that in our next one because it was so informative. We do have a lot of connections also with Liberia. Dr. Lawrence Clark from the World Bank was Guyanese, and he spent a lot of time with one of the prime ministers. And of course, we're all Caribbean people. But coming back to your point, Campbell, yes, these are exciting times. The Dutch, they've apologized on 19th of December. They've put together a fund of 200 million euros. The Church of England, they've apologized. The Portuguese Prime Minister is stating that Portugal should apologize. In the States, you have HR 40. Today, Cory Booker in the United States is trying to get a resolution passed on reparations. We have First Repair in Illinois is actually giving out reparations. So the global environment is such that reparations is the topic of the day. Of course, we had the Black Lives Movement, and that accelerated Black consciousness in Europe and all over the world, and that seemed to trigger some other things. Hopefully, our prime ministers in the Caribbean will act. So far, we've heard silence, which is very disturbing, and I'm hoping that perhaps civil society, I know Dr. Chinzria um, is representing C-SPAN, we need to urge our politicians to act because nothing has happened since the Dutch apologized on the 19th of December. I was in Holland in January. There were over 140 African organizations in Holland, mostly from Suriname, but also from the other Dutch colonies. They're forming a reparations commission. So yes, it's very a ripe period for reparations for that discussion. The coronation brought out some other issues. There were 12 monarchs over 270 years that brutalized us. So the issue is what will King Charles do? Charles I and Charles II were very central to classifying us as subhuman and raping Africa and also the Caribbean. So we need to come together holistically in the Caribbean, and unfortunately, that's not happening. We need to act as a Caribbean people. Caribbean civilization is at risk. We had physical slavery, now we have mental slavery. And now, when you look at Guyana with our oil, there's economic slavery. And we still are not recognizing the global capitalist system is anti Caribbean. And we need to deal with reparations from the point of view that it's not only legally ours, it's morally and spiritually ours. And so, as people of advocating for reparations in the Caribbean, we need to come together as a civil society body to urge our prime ministers who have their own geopolitical issues facing them, whether it's the IMF holding funds or this or that. You know how the West operates. But we, as the public, we as civil society, we have to come together collectively with some strategy to assist our elected people to do what's right because right now they're doing nothing.
To get a clear, yeah. One of the interesting contradictions in the Caribbean, right, is the fact that coming out of the Black Lives Matter movement, which you mentioned in the United States of America, which of course we know had a global impact, you find that monuments to the protagonists of genocide, slavery, indentureship, and apartheid started coming down all over the world. And one of the interesting contradictions is that, for example, in the case of Thomas Picton in the United Kingdom, he was a governor in Trinidad, and his
Yeah.
monuments were removed in Wales and in the UK because of the crimes he committed in Trinidad. But yet, here in the Caribbean, where the descendants of those who were the victims of those crimes live, those monuments are ever present. You have, for example, a very strange case of Queen Victoria in Georgetown. Perhaps you could start by telling us that,
Yeah.
and then let's talk a little bit more about
At the courts.
how we might address this contradiction.
Well, it's mental slavery. We have Queen Victoria here at the courts. We acknowledge her monument more than we acknowledge our heroes, Coffee and people like that. And I'm not certain how we address that.
Yeah,
We were very supportive of your activities in Trinidad. We were supportive of what's happening in UE campus, but we cannot get our own people to get rid of these symbols of oppression and racism. And look, we had people go to the coronation. Well, we were a
yeah.
republic since 1970.
I'm telling
So
you.
there are
Listen,
all these contradictions where we keep holding on to the master, and all the master's doing is slapping us and giving us more crumbs and telling us that they did something great for us in that they stopped slavery. And
yeah,
we believe that crap.
yeah. I
So
think that for the
collectively,
benefit
we
of our
need to
listeners,
re educate ourselves. It's part of the 10-point plan. Yeah, we need to re-educate ourselves. We don't even know who we are. We don't know where we came from. We don't know there were powerful civilizations before slavery. We keep believing that Africans sold Africans, which is a myth because it was a age of terror where Europeans went to Africa with a gun and told our chiefs that if you don't give us slaves from other tribes, we will take you as slaves. So there's total miseducation, and the monuments highlight this. Where when monuments are coming down, Colston in the UK, we're erecting more modern statues to imperialism,
exactly,
and it's
exactly.
quite
I think.
sad. But the educational system, we don't teach history, which is another crisis.
Yeah, I think to add to your point, during the Black Lives Matter movement, the monument that came down, the individual whose monuments fell the most was Christopher Columbus. But right now, we have the largest
Columbus,
monument to Christopher Columbus in the world in Puerto Rico, which was erected just a few years ago, and apparently, it broke the treasury in that country. But I think the case of Queen Victoria in Guyana is a telling case because that statue was bombed in the 1950s, 1954, by your great and legendary poet
yes, yes,
Martin Carter and one of his colleagues. That
Martin
was then
Carter,
taken to that monument was then taken to the UK by the colonial powers, repaired and brought back to Guyana. When Forbes Burnham came into
repaired,
power, he took it and dumped it on its face in the back of the botanical gardens. Somebody in recent times
absolutely,
decided to bring that back to that location. I think it was when you had the visit of some of the royals. What happened there?
yes.
Yes, some royals visited, and
We,
they brought that monument back. But I have to say, I'm grateful that you guys during the BLM movement, you all threw some red paint on it. But certainly, that monument cannot
yes.
remain there. But that's one of the contradictions. But tell us, I mean, you mentioned all the things that are happening across the world, the Dutch, the Church of England. We could add to that the Catholic Church's repudiation of the doctrine of discovery,
Doctrine of
the
Discovery.
reparations vote in the state of California. There's just so many different things that is actually happening at such a dizzying pace. It's hard to keep up. Why? What do you think? And you've mentioned some of the things that account for the way that our lack of action. But what do you think we in civil society can do to make a difference? How do you think we could put pressure on these governments?
I think we need to have a Caribbean civil society reparations movement that is separate than the CARICOM Reparations Commission. But
Hmm.
the two need to work together. the civil society reparations group in the Caribbean can be more, how can I say, more forward looking, more aggressive in its demands, in its articulation of the situation in the Caribbean, our health problems, our education problems, our joblessness, and the fact that there needs to be reparatory justice. Now, Jamaican judge on the International Court of Justice, Patrick Robinson, in February held a 2 day conference that showed that the amount of money owed to the Caribbean or for the Triangle Slave Trade was $101 trillion. The details are there. We know it's a crime against humanity. I'm hoping that something happens at the permanent forum because, as you see, only sovereign states have local standing in the courts. And if
Yeah.
the sovereign states are not acting, we are left in a void.
Yeah.
Now, our Caribbean leaders have many issues that confront them. They're worried about, well, we talked about invasions. I don't want to get to that, but they're worried about invasions because invasions happen in many ways. An invasion can happen with you being denied credit from the World Bank or the African American. There's so many ways that they can deny us. But we as civil society need to mobilize. We are like trees.
Yeah.
We're building oak
Dr.
trees
Phillips,
in the
Dr.
Oakville
Phillips,
country. Mhm.
when you say the Caribbean governments are worried and concerned, it appears as if the those in charge actually are on our side, but feel pressured not to act that way. Last year at Emancipation, we had a member of Parliament, a minister of government, stand on a public platform at Emancipation and state, and this wasn't carried in the press. I happened to be standing right next to him when he made these comments, that his government was not interested in the decade for people of African descent because when he looked at all the things that they were calling for, he realized that they had done those things already. So I'm suggesting to you that beyond their fears, there is a certain degree of, I don't want to use the word ignorance, but a lack of understanding of what the issues are. And perhaps they represent a particular segment of our population to a large extent that is probably the victims of colonial epistemic violence.
You're absolutely right. Let's look at the decade. Guyana, under David Granger, was the only sovereign state that had a subvention of half a million US a year. This new government is attacking that. But in the Caribbean, I think it's not just lack of knowledge, it's lack it's more self-interest, personal self-interest. Some of our prime ministers have delusions of grandeur and being general secretary of the United Nations or being seen as the new, how can I put it, the new darling of the World Bank. And they act against our own interests because they have this delusion that they're loved by the West. I mean, I'm glad to see that damn Amos, who went to Durban and said that the British will not say they're sorry for slavery. And she's Guyanese. She's born in Wakenham next to my grandmother. She went there because she is now British and acted against our interests. I'm glad to see that over time she's sort of backed off from that. But we have a lot of leaders in the Caribbean who are lost, who are not Afrocentric, who are not Pan Africanists, who are just opportunists. I don't want to call names, you know who they are. And they prevent us from getting reparations. The Dutch have apologized. It's the number one point in our 10-point plan. We should be mobilizing our lawyers to see how to go to court. We're not. They've been silenced. We have a lot of development issues in the Caribbean.
Yeah,
We
Dr.
keep
Phillips, I
thinking,
got to
all of
stop
our
you for
leaders,
one
it
second
can't
there,
be possible.
just to say just to say goodnight to our listeners on Talk City 91.1, since that station is going to be signing off now. So I want to say a special good night to those of you listening to us on Talk City 91.1 and invite you to join us on the Emancipation Support Committee's Facebook page for further conversations. And there, of course, you can send your comments and your questions, and I'll share them with our listeners. Back to you, Dr. Phillips. Sorry about that.
Yes, you see, they're not suffering the way Caribbean people are suffering. They have benefits, and they
Yes.
do not recognize that Caribbean civilization is at risk. Owen Arthur said that such a long time ago. Without reparatory justice, we don't have sustainable economies. Yes, Guyana has oil, but that's being depleted. But we can't look at Guyana as Guyana. We have to look at ourselves as Caribbean people. We have to be worried about what's going on in Haiti. We're even saying that Haitians shouldn't come to Guyana. We have 83,000 square miles. That's madness. So what I'm saying is that it's not just a lack of knowledge, it's political self-interest, because they're looking at things, they're looking at the trees without seeing the forest. And the forest is a global capitalist system, and how they're undermining Caribbean civilization, and how they're putting ethnic groups against others. We have a whole ethnic chasm in the Caribbean between Indians and Africans and now indigenous people. That is being manufactured to keep us fighting among ourselves while they're getting away with the murder of our ancestors, and today the murder of our future generations. Because without giving us reparatory justice and giving us the type of financial reparations that are necessary and that we deserve, we will continue to struggle, and we'll continue to look to England as, be happy about King Charles, which is, that shows how mentally insane we are.
Insane. Okay, let me thank you, Dr. Phillips. Let me bring in our special guest, Dr. Chenzira, and my co-host, Reverend Kamau, into the conversation now as we go into Indaba overtime for the next 15 minutes.
I'm familiar with Indaba over time. This is a wonderful opportunity. There's several things I wanted to highlight. One is that when persons think of where I'm sitting now, I'm on the Isle of St.
It looks
Croix.
like you're on a beach, Doctor.
We try our best to keep the vibration in the heights. Yeah?
All right.
St. Croix is in the Virgin Islands, and many persons like to say the U.S. Virgin Islands when the legal name is the Virgin Islands of the United States, which is quite different. And it's moving in a direction to decolonize, to engage in self-determination, and there's a whole host of elements in that. And some of the reparatory justice efforts have very early beginnings right here in the Virgin Islands, particularly with the civil society organizations that were instrumental to bringing this discussion coming within the Caribbean space and keeping us, because we're geographically in the Caribbean. Our population is predominantly persons of African ancestry, indigenous ancestry, grounded with ties to as far as south as Guyana, as far inclusive of Suriname, Venezuela, Colombia, etc. And not just the Latin piece, but the African indigenous presence. Yeah. And I think it's really important that persons recognize that as well, because we've been working in concert. Part of the work that's happening in the Caribbean Pan-African Network is around being able to have representation in this region and to then lend our voice, lend our action, and begin to do this mobilization that I know him as Chief Eric, so forgive me if I don't say all of the other portions. I'm accustomed to seeing him in that capacity as a royal. And I think it's important that persons get an opportunity to just know that there are so many different organizations that don't get their voice heard because they're busy in the trenches doing select work. They're not necessarily engaged in these particular formations. And the intention is to bring at least their 2 to 3 points that they'd like to see highlighted so that way our body can actually mobilize. It's going to require a certain level of strategic engagement like none other than before. And persons like to come back to that vibration of what transpired around the globe with the George Floyd piece. What's happening right now with the situation in the Ukraine? It went around the planet. Everybody put up a Ukraine flag in front of their home. We didn't do that for Haiti. We didn't do that for what's happening in West Papua New Guinea. We don't even do that sometimes for what's going on in Africa. Once in a while, you might see, help people in Cameroon, help people in South Africa, whatever. But we don't do that because there's been a concerted reorganization of the mindset of humanity to dismantle anything African indigenous. I'm going to say that again, to dismantle the mindset. So it's not just or as you were saying delicately, the ignorance per se. It's that the whole mindset, the programming, the psychological, sociological frame of referencing, the way they've dismantled our economies. And if you get to people's money and their food source and their health, you have them, they're going to lay down. They're going to just follow like sheeple. They're not even people anymore. And it's really important that we recognize that this is trauma. This is a type of trauma. And that's exactly why reparations has to be happening, and it needs to happen now. And it cannot be, it has to be done with no apology, like not even an explanation. That we don't need to do another 20 years of research and all of this information because they have enough data, they have enough examples, they have enough. Hmm, there's been enough terrorism done.
I think that while we acknowledge the weaknesses in
Each.
the reparations movement in the region, those of us who have that historical background in this movement, or like myself, who grew up in a movement that was dedicated to reparations, who would have been around the discussion at a time when we didn't expect to see it arrive anywhere near this level in our lifetime. You know, we have to be cognizant of the gains that we are making here and the speed at which those gains are being made. Perhaps that's something we can celebrate.
Yes, yes. And with the Africa Union coming on board, with the traditional kings and queens coming on board, the movement is accelerating like you wouldn't believe. We need to capitalize on it. And I fully agree with what was just said. It's our knowledge that has been taken from us and replaced with the type of Western orientation that is anti us.
Indeed.
There's a very interesting perspective that I would love to get your take on, Dr. Phillips, and perhaps yourself as well, Dr. Chenzira. And it has to do with the fact that only states has standing within the ICJ. There's a loophole, however, such that through the United Nations, if there is an organization, if there's a forum operating, and there is a plebiscite within that forum to take an issue to the International Court of Justice by way of compulsion, by way of unanimous consent and support, then indeed it can happen. There is a move right now by Sifiwe Baleka from the Balanta Society and Association, where he has written to the PFPAD and he has requested that a plebiscite be done such that we can compel, as it were, the forum to approach the International Court of Justice on behalf of people of African ancestry to once and for all settle this whole issue of reparations at that level of the ICJ and recognize our status within the diaspora, certainly within the continent, as that as of prisoners of war and the survivors of prisoners of war, and with the ethnocide and with the genocide and certainly the ecocide that has happened in the African continent and outside the African continent, there are some voices that believe that a plebiscite, a unanimous decision compelling the Permanent Forum and other such organizations and forums to take it to the International Court of Justice, perhaps maybe a masterstroke of legal tactic to engage this process. What are your thoughts with regards to that type of move on behalf of civil society, bypassing the state actors who seem reluctant to act either because of lack of knowledge, because of the delusions of grandeur, or perhaps illusions of inclusion, where you believe that you are invited to the table, but you really are not. Can we bypass these state actors and act as a civil society, connecting with and executing the plebiscite mechanism within international, of course, legal standing to force some type of decision, to force some type of engagement. I would love to hear your response with regards to that.
I fully agree with you that that strategy has to be pursued. And I think it will be discussed at the permanent forum at the end of the month. I know I've spoken to people here, I've spoken to people in Holland, civil society groups, and that's what they're looking at. I've also spoken to Patrick Robinson, who is the Jamaican judge in the International Court of Justice, and he believes that such a move is necessary. So I'm hoping that our legal minds, our civil society minds, and we have many lawyers in that grouping, will find a way to do this because our sovereign states need help. And this strategy might be the best way to go.
I just wanted to really give thanks for some of the comments that are also coming up on this network around this discussion from early on, because a lot of it is really in synergy with what we've been speaking towards in regard to having taking power, reclaiming what is authentically ours, and of course just standing collectively and moving in some type of unity. It's very difficult if persons do not recognize that there has been a long standing history of, what you're seeing in reparations activities now. It's like really moving and it's very active, and it's, oh wow, and more people are excited, and that's fabulous. However, there's a very long standing, like decades upon decades, for those
Going
that
right
remember.
back to emancipation and even prior
Exactly.
to emancipation.
Exactly. And I think it's very,
Yes,
very critical for
yes,
person to
yes.
just be comfortable in knowing that this is the peak or the crowning of a lot of work, a
We're
lot of work
standing
that.
on the shoulders of our ancestors and building it up.
Exactly, exactly. And it's very important that persons recognize that. I think it's also one of the comments that kept coming up consistently on what has been shared online is also around this Caribbean civilization piece and the importance of, again, like I said, the unification piece, in which for us, the liberation portion, and then navigating this social governance so that we have the strategies, we have the data, and making sure that this data, once it's collected, because we know what happens when data is collected and it's
Mm.
misinterpreted.
Yeah.
We know what happens.
Dr. Chenzira, you've
Yeah.
mentioned data all night, but we have to be more specific. Eh? We're talking about, we have to speak in terms of what data we want and what data we need. And I know that there's one of the kinds of data is data on racial discrimination
True.
in the
It's racial
Caribbean. That's one of
discrimination.
the types of data that we have to collect across school, health, jobs, workplaces, housing,
Exactly.
etc. But we have, guys, 1 minute left in the program now, and Dabo overtime is coming to end. So let's have our closing remarks. And before we go, let me thank you in advance for joining us here on Indaba tonight.
I'm going to
Perhaps Dr. Chenzira, you will
but
you
I'd
will
like to
make your
be very
closing remarks first.
exactly. I just want to thank Indaba for just giving us an opportunity to share this information and encouraging persons to really be participatory. May 23rd. I know it's on the eve of African Liberation Day, and a lot of persons are going to be involved in things, but to at least be there, 12:30, May 23rd, for this preparatory piece that's going to provide some recommendations for the second meeting of the Permanent Forum for People of African Descent. And I'm looking forward to being a part of the process, but more importantly, that we have some recommendations that have teeth that can be implemented to the best of our ability. We always say act first. Give
Thank
thanks.
you, Dr. Chenzira. Dr. Phillips?
Thank you very much for this forum. I think it's badly needed. Oops.
And Dr. Phillips, I know Dr. Fergus has left us, but I'm going to,
Yes,
on his behalf, let you know that you can take this entire program that we did today from the ESC's Facebook page and use as much as this as you would like on your TV shows in Guyana. Of course, I've been there. I've been on Channel 9 and some of the other. I know the kind of work that you guys are doing.
we need you
Keep it up.
here. We need you here to bring strength.
Yes, indeed. And anything you want from us in terms of content, please let us know and we'll be happy to share. Brother Kamal?
Absolutely. As we look forward to African Liberation Day, the 25th of May, 2023, it's a very historic time. It represents 60 years in terms of the celebration of African unity, African collectiveness. Rastafari say African unity. A big piece of the Caribbean preparatory meeting would be certainly the contribution, Rastafari would say the attribution of Rastafari to our collective consciousness within the Caribbean. On that note, on the 28th of this month, actually, the All Mansions of Rastafari are going to be hosting a free African Liberation Day cultural show at Woodford Square from 7 a.m. to 7 p.m. I've been asked to speak. I'm told that my co host has also been asked to speak as well. Hopefully, we can get them on the program either in person or by way of their flyer. But we look forward certainly to their presence next week, Tuesday, for the Caribbean Preparatory Meeting on, of course, the Permanent Forum on African Descent. Again, coming up soon. Looking forward to each and every one of you. Until then, we're out of time, but not out of words and out of love. Until the next one. Peace.
All
Okay.
right. I see Dr. Fergus is here. Dr. Fergus,
Not yet,
I
Yes,
please.
don't know
Not
where
yet,
you
please.
went. You
I
disappeared.
lights were flickering and they put me in backstage. It had nothing to do with me deliberately, but I was taking in every word. What I would like to say, I would have wanted to join the conversation, especially with Dr. Phillips, but I would like to suggest that we have Dr. Phillips back and not too long from now so that we can continue this conversation. I think there are lots of things we need to address, and I like that suggestion that you made with respect to civil society taking charge.
It's a
Civil
masterpiece.
society
It's a
was
masterstroke.
the initial force behind reparations. I have said, and my colleagues have heard me say already, that the reparations leadership dropped the ball and allowed governments to take charge rather than continue to collaborate with government. They allow the government to take charge, and that is what has resulted in so many of the national reparations committees not functioning. Largely.
Yes, and of
Now,
course,
what I would like to ask, perhaps you need not answer now, is it possible that civil society, when we regroup to take charge, whether registering, the NGOs that register, if you register through your local authorities, parliament, whatever it is, but you are incorporated as such, and whether CARICOM as a body can incorporate collectively, I don't know what the power of CARICOM is, but definitely you can incorporate at a local level. But if it is impossible to incorporate at a CARICOM level, the civil society organization, and beyond that, where governments would now be seen as a partner rather than a leader, having to depend on government. There are so many CLCs that I know of, particularly, that are not functioning. And governments,
Yes.
the government of those territories either are not interested or cannot demonstrate that they are interested. They may say, but I know I'm being cautious, and my colleagues will know why I am being cautious. But they do
Mr.
not
Fergus, Mr. Fergus, may I say a few words on
empirically,
that?
they are really and truly interested in moving the reparations agenda forward.
yeah,
So I would,
Dr. Philip,
but
we're gonna have you back. We're gonna have you back.
What
We are
we,
going to have you back to
yeah,
continue this
what we did
conversation.
in Guyana,
I
yeah,
have
what we did in
instructions. We have
Guyana is that
30
we
seconds.
invited the public. Yes,
Yeah,
what we did in
we have
Guyana
to
is that
go.
we invited the public to all of our reparations meetings. So we have 50 to 60 people every Thursday. We didn't rely on commissioners because commissioners, 4 or 5 show up. You have to incorporate the public, which is civil society. So I fully agree with your vision, and that's how we have to approach it.
And we are going to pursue
Whether we
your
could do it
vision, Dr.
structurally
Philip.
and legally, our
And,
lawyers and our own civil society brains will sort of.
yeah.
Thank you.
Dr. Philip, we're going to pursue that vision that you articulated here tonight on Indaba, the place where knowledge grows, the place to find consensus, the voice of the people, the voice of the Emancipation Support Committee. I am your host, Shabaka Kambon, with Dr. Claudius Fergus, Reverend Kwame Kamau, and we want to thank you for joining us on another edition. I invite you to join us again next week, Wednesday, for another edition of Indaba. Good night, all.